cool evening in March 2008, Mrs. Shirley Sherman had been calling out 11-year-old Thomas Hunter to leave his gaming station and come up for lunch for the past 10 minutes. But to no avail. Everyone knew that Tom liked his video games more than anything else. And once he settled in front of it, nothing else mattered to him until he decided to get up by himself. Unfortunately, that didn't work for her, and she needed to feed him before his father got back from work. She called out to him one more time, and coincidentally, she heard the front door creak open. There was initially no cause for alarm, until she realized that it was supposed to be just her and Thomas in their Dundee home. Her boss, Tom's father, was not supposed to get back from work until much later. Alarmed, Mrs. Sherman made her way out of the kitchen and straight to the living room to find the door wide open. Now she started to panic even more. An intruder had broken into the house, and she had no idea where they might have entered. Her first and most important agenda was to find Tom before the intruder and get them both safely out of the house. In her state of quiet panic, she started to make her way down to the basement, which was where Tom had all of his gaming devices, when she heard heavy footsteps behind her. There was barely any time to move or run before the person grabbed her. It was a man, and he was much bigger than her, breathing heavily down her neck as his beard scratched her up roughly. She could barely move, and she tried to open her mouth to beg for her life, but no words came out. There was something sharp and cold pressed against the back of her neck, and it didn't take a genius to tell her that it was a weapon. "Where's Dr. Hunter?" The man grunted in her ears, his voice scratchy and angry, and when she could not provide a satisfactory answer, he grunted in rage and descended on her, stabbing her neck and then holding her tightly until her small body went limp in his arms. Staring at the lifeless body of this woman whose name he didn't even know, Anthony felt his heart rate start to slow down. The anger and hatred in his heart that he'd been saving for someone else had been taken out on her, but he didn't feel bad. Maybe slightly annoyed, because he was a man who had a mission, but not bad at all. He felt energetic, as if he was finally the bigger person. Sure, he'd not pinned the dart on his victim, but he'd get him next. Behind him, Anthony heard a sharp gasp and a scream from what sounded like a young boy. With bloodied hands, he turned around to face the terror-filled eyes of Thomas Hunter, the 11-year-old son of the very man he was after. Filled with the same unbridled rage that had flooded his heart for so long, Anthony ran after the kid, closing in after him when they entered the dining room. Looking into the dark man's eyes as he descended on him, little Thomas knew that there was no way he was finding his way out. Dr. Bill Hunter had just gotten off his shift at the hospital and was in a hurry to get home. He'd worked overtime again, and he knew that Mrs. Sherman would be eager to get home by now. So he had to get there as soon as possible and apologize to the kind old woman before sending her home. The drive back was quiet, just the rambling from a radio station he didn't even listen to, and he let his mind wander until he reached his front porch. Upon opening the door, Dr. Hunter knew that something was amiss. Mrs. Sherman was usually singing along to something on the television, and the smell of dinner would be permeating the air by now. She believed that it was her utmost responsibility to make dinner for him and his son, and she never left without doing it. The entire house had an eerie, skin-piercing silence to it, the only sounds echoing through being the sounds of his son's video game startup music. Usually, the gaming sounds would be accompanied by his grunts or yells of either loss or triumph. But there was nothing. Stepping into the hallway, Dr. Hunter's heart leapt to his mouth, and he felt everything start to spin. Mrs. Sherman lay face up, a knife stuck in her neck, and a look of terror immortalized on her frozen face. He was a doctor who had seen dead people more times than he could physically count. One would think he was immune to it at this point, but the ice-cold feeling of dread ran through him as he looked through the woman who was definitely dead, was similar to that he felt during the early days of his career as a doctor. Maybe even stronger. "Thomas," he muttered under his breath, before screaming the name out and crossing over Shirley's dead body to get to the basement where his son spent most of his time. The basement was empty, smelling of gym clothes and littered with food wrappers, but there was no sign of his son. Feeling his heart drop even lower, he scrambled out and began searching all around the house for the boy, only pausing when he arrived at the dining area because he had just come across his greatest fear. Thomas Hunter was almost unrecognizable. Whoever had done this must have had it out for his son, because he would not even have known that it was him if not for the bloodied blue Minecraft t-shirt he had brought him as a birthday present and his long gangly limbs that looked a little too stiff. Collapsing to the ground, Bill crawled closer to his son's body and felt for a pulse, warmth, or anything to signify that there was still a modicum of life in the boy. But there wasn't. His boy was gone for good. With a blurry vision and shaky hands, Dr. Hunter called 911 and gave as much information as he possibly could. While waiting for them to arrive, the doctor thought helplessly, why would anyone want to kill his son and housemaid? What had the sweetest woman he'd ever met, and his clueless 11-year-old son, done to offend someone so badly that they decided to kill them in such a brutal and sick manner? Little did Bill Hunter know that he'd been the main target of a very angry man that he'd interacted with a little over a decade ago. It was a case of unfortunate luck for the doctor, where his life was spared, but at the expense of 2 others. Early beginnings. Anthony Joseph Garcia was born on the 7th of June, 1973, to Fred and Estela Garcia, and he was the first of 3 children. His father, Fred, was a postal service worker, and his mother, Estela, was a nurse, so they had pretty respectable careers, although they did often wish that they had more. Finances were always tight in the Garcia household, and Estela always made little comments here and there about how much better things would have been for them if she'd become a doctor. These little comments would soon turn into subtle messages that she ingrained in her young son's brain, letting him know just how much she wanted him to do what she couldn't. It's safe to say that little Anthony was pressured from when he was a small kid to become a doctor. That sounds like a very familiar tale to a lot of us, I'm sure. As mentioned before, the Garcias had a lot of financial problems, which made Fred and Estela have to work a lot of overtime and overnight shifts. When they realized that their young son would be left alone for more hours than was deemed normal, they decided to take him to stay with his grandparents. While he stayed there were occasional visits from his parents, but that was the most he saw of them for the next couple of years. The time they spent working paid off, and after a few years, they were financially stable enough to raise their own family, and that was when they were reunited with their son, Anthony. There was so much joy that it led to the family expanding, and thus his 2 siblings were born. The Garcia family lived a pretty normal life, and things were going well for them until Anthony had to start going to school. It was apparent that something was wrong. The boy was a little slower than all of his classmates, but his parents brushed it off, thinking it was something that would fix itself. After all, they believed children grew at their own pace. They were proven wrong when Anthony was finally diagnosed with a reading disorder in the 2nd grade. This came as a shock to his parents, but they believed that their son could work through it. Despite being terrible at reading, Anthony excelled with numbers better than anyone else in his level, and he believed that it was enough for him because he had no interest in reading anything at all. The young boy had dreams of being a mathematician, which he mentioned to his parents on many occasions. Fred and Estela were horrified to hear that their first son wanted to take a less than honorable path, instead of the one they wanted for him. It took a lot of coaxing, convincing, and ultimately guilt-tripping from his parents to make the boy start to walk the path that they wanted for him. But eventually it all worked, and Anthony's life started moving in the path that they wanted for him. The hardships begin. Kids can be mean, and Anthony was often on the receiving end of their brutality, having to withstand mockery from his classmates for being at the far end of the developmental spectrum. Still, he carried on, finishing from high school and then going on to California University, Los Angeles, where he'd spend 4 years navigating through with average grades and the reading and comprehension level of a 5th grade student. Despite working as hard as he possibly could, Anthony's grades remained the way they were, and he did woefully on all of his medical exams, which depressed him even further. Being a quiet person meant that he kept to himself and didn't have many friends, or any friends at all, and there was no one to share his predicament with, no one to offer help or kind words. He didn't know how to ask for help or know when help was being offered, so he suffered a great deal all by himself. While his father did no more than the occasional call to see how he was faring, Estela, his mother, was more hands-on in his life. He was her first son, and he was fulfilling her lifelong dream. It was the least she could do to check up on him regularly. One time, Estela went to see her son in school, but she was shocked by the sight before her. Anthony resembled a shell of the boy she knew. His usually bulky frame was significantly smaller and was now replaced by a frumpy layer of clothes. His curly hair was long past his shoulders and seriously unkempt, and his eyes had dark circles and were sunken in so deep that he almost looked unrecognizable. Despite all of this, Estella felt herself beam with a strange sense of pride. She knew that studying to be a doctor was hard enough on its own, but it was refreshing to see that she didn't raise a quitter. Despite all the things that made the process even harder for him, he persevered through it all, and that made him a perfect son in her eyes. Anthony watched his mother gush over him, and as she urged him to eat all of his favorite meals that she prepared for him, he felt his heart sink even deeper than before. His initial plan had been to tell her that his reading disabilities had been making things a little harder for him, and that he was considering changing his major to mathematics, the one thing he was actually good at. But seeing how happy she was with him made his heart overflow with guilt. He couldn't break her heart in this way, so he decided to use her pride and all of her dreams to motivate himself to get further. She deserved something good after all he had put her through. Estella Garcia left fulfilled, and Anthony Garcia was left even more depressed than he was before. Unfortunately, nothing was enough to pick him up, and Anthony remained average with his grades, barely passing any of the important exams that he needed to get into medical school with. His professors saw him as a hopeless case, and they did their best to get him to the point where he needed to graduate. With his unimpressive grades and very average medical exam scores, the chances of Anthony getting into medical school seemed almost next to impossible for him. After he graduated from college, Anthony applied to as many medical schools as he humanly could, but all he saw was rejection letter after rejection letter, and all of it soon started to get to him, driving him into a state of depression. Like a last-minute miracle, 21-year-old Anthony finally got an acceptance letter from the University of Utah, and he could not contain his joy. He informed his parents, who hugged him and, for the first time, looked at him with something other than pity for the first time in months. He was just happy to have been accepted, not thinking about how he would survive. Seeing his college was a very uneventful roller coaster, the start of the downward spiral. The 4-year program started in 1994, and young Anthony was stressed out by the curriculum and just the early days of med school. He had the reading capabilities of a 5th grader, and it made medical school so much harder for him. There is a lot of reading that goes on as a med student. It includes a lot of hands-on training and incredibly detailed scientific information. A lot of medical terminology is very complex and in Latin, making it much harder for anyone, let alone someone with his condition. So it was a wonder that Anthony was even able to reach this point. But whatever grace he had was beginning to prove insufficient, as his grades were becoming increasingly bad. There was even the challenge of understanding bad handwriting. Believe it or not, the myth about doctors having horrible handwriting is true. And for someone with a reading disability, this already difficult task can prove impossible. Even though he was given exam accommodation, he was failing all of his most important classes horribly, so much so that he was placed on academic probation and would be kicked out if he did not improve. It was incredibly depressing for the young man to continue amidst his predicament, but he persevered, using the academic probation as inspiration to work even harder to get his grades up and past the point of needing to be on probation or to risk having to drop out. His mother continued to be his biggest fan, urging him to do better. But even though his grades got better, his mood never did. He started to become more pessimistic and more depressed, letting his negative emotions fuel his work. He still had no friends to confide in or talk to, and because of this, Anthony turned to alcohol as a vice. It started with him just having a few drinks on occasion to help relieve stress, and then it turned to him drinking after every class, and before long, it became a crutch that he could not let go of. Alcohol was his best friend, and he used it to cope. But the relationship was an unhealthy one, and before long, it started to show in his coordination at the hospital where he worked as a student doctor. No one seemed to have good things to say about Anthony, as he handled his patients with a harshness that was not supposed to be seen in any medical professional. A patient once complained that he had made her routine vaginal checkup procedure extremely painful, and there were many more complaints in similar manners. The evaluations from his professors were poor, and his actions were becoming a bit too reckless. It was almost as if he'd started to take out the stresses of his life and his academic frustration on his poor patients. Despite all of this, Anthony continued to pursue his dream of becoming a doctor, finally achieving it when he graduated in 1999 at the age of 26. It took him 5 years instead of 4, but Anthony was just glad to have finished with it. Even with all of his shortcomings, Anthony matched with a residency program in New York, and during the summer, his father helped him pack up all of his belongings into a car, and they drove down to the city. It was there he started his residency at Bassett St. Elizabeth Medical Center, hoping to specialize in pathology in the long run. Pathology is basically the study of diseases and its development in the human body, and they're key doctors in doing things like researching cells and tissues, and even doing autopsies. They don't usually interact with patients directly. Even with that, they're still expected to treat patients with thoughtfulness and respect like every other doctor. Anthony was the prime example of what thoughtfulness wasn't, and it didn't take the staff at the Bassett Hospital too long to realize that Anthony was not prime hospital material. He'd given patients the wrong prescriptions on multiple occasions. He'd given sedatives to a patient whose chart specifically said not to sedate, and he regularly slept on duty. Once he slept while a pregnant patient was in excruciating labor that needed professional attention. Even with his shortcomings, doctors tried to be patient with him, but Anthony proved unreasonable and unreceptive to correction, refusing to take responsibility for his actions and blaming other doctors for the dangerous mistakes he made. He responded to any kind of attempt to correct him with aggression, shutting them down aggressively before they could speak to him, and soon enough, everyone was sick of his behavior. It had started to become apparent from his aggressive tendencies and awkward social behavior that he turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism, and that this was just him acting out as a result of it. When the matter was brought to the knowledge of the director of Bassett residency program, he called Anthony in and asked him to undergo psychological counseling. Anthony didn't heed the director's advice, and like an instant karmic reaction, he had a wild outburst. It happened when he was put in charge of taking care of a younger patient, a 12-year-old boy. The boy was severely ill, and Anthony just stood idle in the room, not paying attention to him. When a radiologist came into the room to inspect the situation, because there must have been groans of pain from there, he saw Anthony just standing around instead of attending to the boy. The radiologist asked what the matter was, to find out why this kid was crying out in pain, and Anthony just exploded out of the blue. He began screaming obscenities at the radiologist, and he was a much bigger man too, so you can imagine how he looked. After the situation ended, the radiologist decided to report him to the authorities because his behavior had become uncontrollable. When the matter reached the hospital's disciplinary committee, they started to deliberate a way to deal with the situation, but before they could, Garcia quit. Now, with being in a residency program, voluntarily leaving looks a little suspicious, but getting kicked out was a sure way to have a stain on your reputation forever, and he was smart enough to figure out that was his best bet to not ruin his budding medical career. Ordinarily, a residency is supposed to last anywhere from 3 to 4 years, and Garcia had only spent 8 months at his. With barely a half-complete program, he begrudgingly moved back into his parents' home in California. It's unclear whether or not his folks knew the reason for his incomplete program, but they noticed his off demeanor. Even though he'd started to consider quitting the medical field forever and just doing something else, he half-heartedly continued to apply for more residency programs. In all of his applications, he would deliberately miss out on mentioning his failed program at Bassett because he knew that it would reduce his chances of getting a place elsewhere. His twisted tactic worked because in July of 2000, he got a placement in Creighton University as they accepted him as a resident doctor. This is the hospital where he would have his first doctor targets. 27-year-old Anthony Garcia started his second residency at Creighton University, and his first months were very calm and successful, which is surprising considering his history at Bassett. He must have understood that if he messed this one up, getting a third chance afterwards would be next to impossible. During his first rotation, he received a very sparkly review from his supervising faculty member. Unlike the staff at Bassett who had seen Anthony's very odd behavior, the authority thought him to be very well-mannered and detail-oriented. For the first time in his life, Anthony finally seemed to be enjoying something in the medical field as well. He posed for photos regularly in his white lab coat and sent them to his parents back home in California, who were incredibly thrilled at the fact that their son was not only doing well, but he seemed happy and stable as well. Sadly, this facade of a perfect life didn't hold up too well as time went on. It soon became apparent that Garcia was not as smart as his counterparts, because while he did well in basic laboratory practices, he seemed to lack a lot of basic information, and when his work peers started to look down on him, he started to become depressed again, living life on autopilot. This depression spiraled into anger, and before long, They turned into angry outbursts at faculty members that he didn't like and his fellow students that he didn't like. When it was time for his review in the fall, Dr. Chandra Butra was particularly outspoken about his behavior because she believed that medicine was not his true calling. She was a no-nonsense woman who held residents to a very high standard and expected nothing less than the best from them, because she intended to prepare them for the real world. And to her, the real world pitied no one. Her review was scathing and extremely detailed, much more than those of her counterparts. And it was so shocking that it was sent to the office of Dr. Bill Hunter, the director of the pathology residency program. Dr. Hunter was the go-to person whenever a student needed intervention or displayed any concerning behavior. He was known for usually being a mediator and mentor for those troubled students, guiding them through with a calm understanding and kindness. For him, Anthony was just another student who needed his help. In January 2001, Dr. Hunter organized a meeting with Anthony to discuss the things that Dr. Butra had said in her review. Instead of being calm and listening, Anthony got defensive, strongly believing that Dr. Chandra Butra had it out for him and only wanted him to fail. It was safe to say that the meeting did not end on a satisfactory note at all. If anything, it made Garcia start to become intolerant of Dr. Butra, displaying his rude behavior openly to her. In February, she sent another review of Anthony's behavior to Dr. Hunter's desk, and as a response, he berated her in public. This shocked Dr. Butra, and she spoke to the board, asking them to remove Anthony immediately. The decision didn't sit well with Dr. Hunter, who was convinced that with a little more patience and kindness, he would figure out how to help and reform him. Unfortunately, Dr. Bill was the only person who thought this, because even the chair of the pathology department felt like Anthony was being a nuisance at the hospital. Dr. Roger Brombach did not approve of the soft-handed approach that Dr. Bill was putting on, but with some convincing, he decided not to make the decision to kick him out of the program under one condition: that Dr. Hunter worked with and inspected him closely. Not too long after, Dr. Hunter sat in on an autopsy and Anthony misdiagnosed the cause of death. Another faculty member tried to offer feedback and Anthony ignored it, refusing to change his analysis. Basically, he was making things much worse for himself and giving Dr. Hunter more reasons to consider kicking him out of the residency program. But instead of doing that, he gave Anthony another chance to correct himself. This act he would soon regret. It's so odd that even with all of these chances, Anthony did not sit up or adjust his behavior. He just continued to act out. Not too long after his former incident, he had another incident during an autopsy, and for a small portion of the procedure, Anthony was left unsupervised. During the procedure, he opened up the body in front of Dr. Hunter and did what he was supposed to do. But in the unsupervised moment before he left, he flipped the corpse from where it was lying on its back so that it was now lying on its stomach. This is bad for many reasons, one of them being that because of blood not being circulated around the body, it pools in one place, and if that happens when the corpse is on its stomach, it causes discoloration, which can leave the corpse unrecognizable. For families who would want to have an open casket funeral for their loved ones, or just want to see their faces one last time, this can make it very devastating. This was the case of the corpse that Anthony flipped when the funeral home director came in the next morning. The face was completely disfigured and discolored. Not only was this extra evidence of Anthony's inability to follow rules, it was also very embarrassing for Creighton University as a whole. The family of the deceased suffered the worst, saying goodbye to their loved one who they could not recognize. For the first time, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Brombach, and Dr. Butra were on the same page about Anthony. He needed to leave before he caused any other problems that they'd not be able to control. In spite of everything, Dr. Hunter understood that a termination from a residency program was a permanent scar on one's record, and that it would only be by a special miracle before they'd be able to get into another one. So he made a deal with Anthony to let him finish his year at the residency and give him a certificate for that 1 year of training. His contract would not be renewed for a second year, but the certificate would have a stellar review so that he'd be able to get a job elsewhere. He also asked Anthony to apologize to Dr. Butra as well, and Anthony acted grateful, agreeing to apologize for his incredibly unprofessional behavior. Deep down, he was livid. He hated what he'd been reduced to, and blamed Dr. Butra, Dr. Brombach, and Dr. Hunter for not being able to finish another program. In the following months, his performance visibly improved, and in May 2001, He received a good review from an evaluator, like the ones he used to receive when he first started at Creighton University. For a small amount of time, it looked like Anthony was determined to change for the better, but just as his patterns had shown, good behavior was fleeting, and just 2 days after his stellar review, he struck again. He played a very cheap prank on the chief pathology officer, calling his wife while he was taking a very important test and lying about him needing to leave the exam room to the university or he'd be terminated. Luckily, his wife was able to reach the pathology department, and it didn't take them long to discover who was behind the prank. It seemed like Anthony allowed his jealousy to prevail, and he was trying to ruin his colleague's opportunity. His warped view was that if he couldn't find success at Creighton, he didn't want anyone else to. This was the straw that broke the camel's back for Dr. Hunter. He and Dr. Broombach called Anthony into his office and fired him on the spot. 27-year-old Anthony packed his belongings and left his second residency program. With a second incomplete residency at hand, Anthony's chances of fulfilling his parents' dream of him becoming a doctor were looking incredibly bleak. Somehow, it wasn't completely over for him. Young doctors made mistakes and were fired from residency programs, and a decision to drop out could be for a plethora of reasons, like excessive workload, mental health issues, and maybe family problems. Too many eyebrows wouldn't be raised if he were to apply again. But at this point, Anthony really should have done an internal examination on why he was still pursuing medicine. He obviously abhorred the field, and it showed in how lackadaisical and careless he'd become. But due to mental pressure and alcoholism, he didn't have a clear enough mind to think things through. Unlike his usual aggressive and angry self, Anthony Garcia did not fight with Doctors Hunter and Broombach. Instead, he appealed for mercy a few times, and although he was refused from coming back to Creighton, Dr. Bill Hunter pitied him enough to write letters of recommendation for the other residency programs he applied to. While Anthony's actions should have been unforgivable, Dr. Bill chose to understand that people have different reasons for their actions, and that there's good in everyone. The letters served their purpose, and in July 2001, Anthony got into his third residency at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. For the first year, it seemed like the change of environment was a good change for him. But from the second year, his demeanor started to change. From the beginning of 2003, he started to go into the hospital with suicidal thoughts and homicidal tendencies aimed at his coworkers. It got so bad that he had to be introduced to electroconvulsive therapy, which is an invasive form of therapy that's only introduced when therapy and drugs have had no positive feedback. It's relatively safe and is done under anesthesia, and it works by sending electric currents that disrupt all cerebral activity through the brain. Unfortunately, 6 rounds of ECT was not enough to treat Anthony's mental health, and he returned to his parents' home in California before the end of 2003. Because of all his hospital sessions, Anthony was dragged into $80,000 of debt and filed for bankruptcy in 2005. The financial stress, on top of everything he was going through, escalated his mental health struggles and suicidal thoughts, and before long, he attempted to take his life. His brother saved his life, and after some deliberation, Anthony decided to try medicine once more. Luck was on his side, and in the summer of 2007, he was able to find a 4th residency at Louisiana State University. He moved to Shreveport and started off on a very strong suit. He seemed to run out of luck in February 2008 when he was supposed to be issued his medical license, and the university found one of the skeletons in his closet. They reached out to Dr. Bill Hunter to verify their findings, and he had no choice but to be honest about the situation. Because Anthony omitted the causes of his removal from his earlier residencies, he had to face the consequences, which was removal. On February 26, 2008, 34-year-old Anthony was fired. Angered, his warped reasoning that the only way to stop his past from popping up was to silence the Creighton University director led him to begin planning his revenge plan. In preparation, he bought a smoke-colored license plate shield and withdrew $3,000 from a bank in Shreveport so that he could drive to Omaha, confront Dr. Hunter, and exact deadly revenge. The plan and its end. In March 2008, Anthony drove to Omaha, Nebraska with the intent to kill the man he felt was responsible for him not being able to achieve his parents' dream. He chose not to carry a weapon so that he'd not raise any eyebrows in case he was stopped by police. By 3:20 p.m., just when Thomas Hunter, Dr. Bill Hunter's son, entered the basement to begin playing his video games, Anthony pulled up to the doctor's house in his silver Honda CR-V. He was full of alcohol and anger, ready to hurt the man he felt was responsible for his current state of joblessness. Unbeknownst to Anthony, the hunter's neighbor who lived across the street was driving behind him, and she couldn't see his license plate, but she was alarmed because there'd been a lot of open houses lately. When Anthony parked, he looked in the rearview mirror and locked eyes with the woman in the car behind him. They locked eyes and she got a glimpse of his face, a man with dark hair and olive-colored skin. When he realized that she could see him, he drove his car forward and parked it on another street. His reasoning for it was so that he could avoid lurking eyes, but he didn't think that being a darker-skinned man in a predominantly white neighborhood was already reason enough to raise eyebrows. About 2 more neighbors saw Anthony get into the hunter's home, but they imagined that he was familiar with the family and then looked away. This was where Anthony killed both Shirley and Thomas, stabbing them both to death in the span of 10 minutes. He walked over to his car and drove to his parents' house in California, and Dr. Hunter came back 2 hours later to find his son and housekeeper dead. Derek Moyse and Scott Warner were the detectives that were assigned to the case, and the 2 neighbors who had seen Anthony described a heavy-set, olive-skinned man in the neighborhood and correlated him to a silver Honda CR-V with a blurry, out-of-state license plate. A sketch of the man's face was produced, but even after investigating the Hunter family and Thomas's online gaming presence for the possible killer, no leads were found. Shirley Sherman's family thought that she might have been the target, but there were also no leads. Shirley's family offered a $50,000 reward for additional information on the case and even hired a private investigator. But after a year of unproductive leads, the case went cold. On the 14th of May 2013, piano mover Jason Peterson arrived at the Broomback residence with his crew, and the place seemed empty. Peterson claimed to have seen Roger Broomback's body and immediately called the police. Coincidentally, Moyse and Warner were sent to the Broomback's home, and they found that Roger had gunshot and stab wounds to his neck, and his wife had been stabbed with knives from the kitchen. Immediately, the detectives linked the murders at the Hunter home, and a connection was established between both cases. What even pushed it further was when Moyse learned that both Dr. Hunter and Dr. Broomback had been colleagues. Only 4 days after the Broomback murders, Dr. Chandra Butra reported that her home had been attempted to be broken into on Mother's Day, but nothing had been taken. She and her husband weren't home either. The police concluded that the intruder didn't steal anything because they'd been scared off by the security system. After the Broomback murders, a theory was presented that the attempted break-in at the Butra home was connected to the double homicides. While being hands-on on the case, Moyse came across Anthony Garcia's file and saw that his removal from Creighton University ruined his opportunity to get his license or a job in any other states. He immediately came to the conclusion that this was enough motivation for him to want to harm the doctors. Anthony was now living in Terre Haute, Indiana, and it showed that he had bought a firearm and used his credit card twice in the area around the Broomback murders on Mother's Day. His phone number also showed that he'd searched for the Broomback's address barely a few minutes before the Butra home address. The Indiana law enforcement and Omaha detectives joined forces with the FBI to track Anthony Garcia. On the 15th of July, Anthony was arrested on the highway in Union County, Illinois. He was immediately charged with a DUI as his blood alcohol level was 2 times over the legal limit. His car was searched. A .45 caliber gun was found, along with 50 bullets, a stethoscope, and an LSU lab coat. He was then taken into custody and charged with an additional 4 counts of first-degree murder and the use of a deadly weapon. Attorneys Don Klein and Brenda Beadle from Douglas County were the ones who prosecuted the case. Bob Motta, his wife Allison Motta, his father Robert Motta Sr., and Jeremy Jorgensen were among the defense counsel. But before the trial started, Judge Gary Randall removed Allison Motta from the case for attempting to poison the jury pool after she made some public statements about DNA evidence. Prosecutors showed some evidence during the trial, some of which included a termination letter from Creighton and a handwritten to-do list that included things like put tape on your fingers and buy common shoes. The investigators had also found that when Anthony was in Louisiana, his silver Honda CR-V fit the exact description of the car that was seen at the Hunter home in 2008 at the time of the murders. More evidence had shown that Anthony's saliva sample matched some DNA that was left behind by the person who had attempted to break into the Butra home on the same day Roger and Mary Broomback were brutally murdered. Despite his team's effort to prove him somewhat innocent, things started to look grimmer for Anthony when the prosecutors called in a woman named Cecilia Hoffman, who said that a few years after the murders of Shirley Sherman and Thomas Hunter, Anthony had tried to make romantic advances toward her. When she refused him with the excuse that she only dated bad boys, he told her that he had killed a young boy and an old woman. Maude had tried to rebuff her statement by saying that she had admitted to drinking alcohol on the day of her conversation with the police about the entire incident, but Cecilia mentioned that while she might have been drinking, she was not inebriated. There was also evidence that all 4 of the victims had been stabbed in similar manners, and that the gun that was in Anthony's car matched the same gun that had been left behind at the Broomback crime scene. Anthony did not seem to care about the case as a whole, and his signature lackadaisical attitude shone through more. On the 16th of December 2016, Anthony Joseph Garcia was convicted on 9 counts, 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony, and 1 count of felony burglary. As if they saw that the whole case would not end in their favor, the Maudes withdrew from the case right before he was sentenced, and he was left with a public defender. Initially, his sentencing was delayed because the state of Nebraska was supposed to vote on whether to retain the death penalty or not. But in the month of November of that same year, the death penalty was voted to be retained. In September 2018, Garcia was sentenced to death by a 3-judge panel. He showed no remorse, but the families of the deceased were finally able to breathe the sweet air of relief that their family's killer was finally going to be punished. As of December 22, Anthony is still on death row at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution in Tecumseh.